Hi, this is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories, and today we're going to produce this image in the HOO color palette using PixInsight and Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in PixInsight, and I have already run the data through WBPP to create the master files that we need. This is the setup for WBPP, so you can see that we have hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur of the WR134 region, and altogether this gives me a little under 7 hours of data. So I say we've already run this, so I'll exit from here, and let's look at the output. And to do that, I'll simply navigate to the folder where I keep my swap files and look in the master folder. And here are those three files, sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. And if we're going to produce an HOO image, we really only need the hydrogen and oxygen. So just open those. And this is an almost mechanical process for me. I do kind of the same thing with every image. First, I'll just do a quick screen stretch to look at the result, and that looks pretty good. If you notice my process icons over in the right, these are the ones that I use most of the time. This is channel combinations, which we won't be using here, but I would use if I had RGB data. I have dynamic background extraction in both subtract and division. I have the photometric color calibration, actually the newer spectral photometric color calibration, both for my one-shot color camera as well as for my monochrome camera with RGB filters. Two versions of Blur Exterminator, one is standard and one uses a more aggressive star reduction, particularly halo reduction, which I find works really nicely. The screen transfer function, which I almost always use for the stretch, and the corresponding histogram transformation tool to actually apply that. Noise exterminator and then star exterminator, saved both standard and with a star extraction. And then down here at the bottom I have two process groups. One is noise exterminator followed by star exterminator. The second one is noise exterminator followed by star exterminator and saving the stars. And then lastly I just have a curves and a curves that just applies saturation, which I'll occasionally use. So the first thing I'm going to do, I don't see any reason to run dynamic background extraction on this, so I'm going to go straight to Blur Exterminator, and I'm going to use the more aggressive, which reduces the star halos a little bit more aggressively, gives me just a little bit smaller and tighter stars. I'm finding that seems to work pretty well. So as soon as this is done, it usually takes about 30 seconds. And I say, I just can't say enough good things about Russ Croman's plugins for Blur Exterminator, Noise Exterminator, and Star Exterminator. They just work wonders with my files. I use them on pretty much every image that I work on. So the Blur Exterminator is just about done. We'll see the stars. Stars got smaller. So now I will apply a stretch. So I'll open up the screen transfer function in the histogram transformation, just pop a quick screen stretch on it, and then I'm just using the mouse wheel to zoom in a little bit here so I can adjust the settings just a little bit to bring out just a little bit more contrast. We'll drop those down and apply those. Now we can turn off the screen stretch because we've already stretched the image. And then last I'll apply noise and star exterminator. And I'm just looking at the stars to decide if I want to use these stars or the ones from the HA. I think I'll use these. They look pretty nice. So I'll grab the process group that has the save stars and just drag that onto the image. And the nice thing about the process group is it will run both Noise Exterminator, and then when that finishes it will automatically run Star Exterminator. And I may have to restart it because there's a bit of a bug in Star Exterminator that it doesn't remember its AI version from run to run. So I just had to restart Star Exterminator. Hopefully that'll be fixed in the next release. But this will, again, this takes about 30 seconds. And I'll tell you, I think back to a year ago before I started using PixInsight and Star Exterminator, doing this with Deep Sky Stacker and then StarNet++, which is a great tool, don't get me wrong, but it did not let me use the graphics card in my computer. So it would take basically 1 hour for each filter or for each file. So if I were doing an SHO image, that was 3 hours just for star removal. Now I do it in 30 seconds. So there's the stars. There's the oxygen without the stars. We don't need this anymore. So at this point, I would simply save this. And I always save this in the back in my original taking folder. I don't save the folders in the swap file, but I do back up and save these. And I will save this, it's already stretched, I can save it as a 16-bit TIFF. And I'm just going to give it an extra number here so it doesn't overwrite ones that I already have. And when it asks me my settings, I want a 16-bit TIFF. And again, since this is stretched, we can get by with that. And then I'll do the same thing with these stars. We'll save those again in the in this folder as a TIFF. 16-bit. And now we'll do the same thing with hydrogen. Let's get a quick stretch on it to see what we've got. I will run Blur Exterminator to tighten up the stars. And these are fairly nice looking stars too. Eventually I will go back to this target once the moon is kind of out of the way and capture some RGB data so I can plug in RGB stars. And as long as I keep track of my reference frame that I've used, I can continue to add data or add RGB stars later and just manually choose the reference frame for registration, and then everything will line up and I can just drop it into Photoshop. Now we'll stretch this. Again, we'll just increase the contrast a little bit. Better to err on the side of too light than too dark. Because if you go too dark and you push something all the way to black, then it's gone. So now we will run the Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator on this to create our final starless version of the hydrogen. And then once this is done, we'll load these 3 files into Photoshop as layers and actually begin putting together our HOO image. And I want to go a little bit deeper into some of the things you can do with those layers by using smart objects in Photoshop. Smart objects offer a great way to apply filters like sharpening, noise reduction, dust and scratches, things like that, non-destructively. And you can go back and swap in a new file later if you want to. I mean, you just have all sorts of flexibility. So we'll just save this. And again, we'll go back to our base folder and we'll save this as a TIFF file, 16-bit. And now we're ready to hop into Photoshop. If you've seen my videos before, you know we start by going to Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and that brings up this dialog box. You just browse for the files that you want to load. And again, we'll navigate to that same folder. And here are the 3 files we just created. I tend to keep my folders sorted in date modified, descending date modified sequence, so the newest files are right at the top. Click OK to select the files. Click OK again. And those 3 files will get loaded over here on the right hand side in the layers palette. Now, one thing that's a little bit different here, these are all grayscale images, meaning that there's no color data, that there's no red, green, and blue channel. There's just a grayscale channel. And so the first thing we need to do, since we want to create a colorful HOO image, is we need to convert this to an RGB image. So to do that, we'll go to Image Mode and just change it from grayscale to RGB color. And we don't want to merge. So that's been done, and it applies my default sRGB color space. And the next thing I want to do is rotate this 90 degrees. So I'm just going to go to Image Rotation, 90 degrees clockwise, and I kind of like that orientation better. So now we need to do a little bit of quick housekeeping. Over here on the right, we have the hydrogen layer, the stars layer, and then the oxygen layer on the bottom. And all three are turned on, and they're all in normal blending mode. So the one on top basically hides everything else. We'll put this into a group, which I use the keyboard shortcut Control-G. That would be Command-G on a Mac. Double-click the group name and change it to hydrogen. And then I'm going to add a levels adjustment because I'm sure I'll end up using that. And now I want to see if we need to do any cleanup on this layer itself. So we'll zoom in and see what kind of, we've got some stray artifacts from star removal. So I'm going to start by just grabbing the spot healing brush, and I can just, I am doing this destructively. I rarely find that I want to put back an artifact or a dust spot or something like that. So yeah, I'm okay with doing destructive edits on the image at this point. Once we get much beyond this, it starts to get a little bit more problematic. You can use the left and right bracket keys to make the brush bigger or smaller. And in general, as you move away from areas where there's a lot of detail, you can just move to a larger brush and work even quicker. And as we get further away from that nice fine detail in the center, we'll get even more aggressive with the smoothing out. So we'll say that's good enough for now. There's still some noise and some artifacts out here in this kind of fuzzy region, nebulous region. We'll deal with that separately. This is a good point to talk about a smart object. There's a couple things I want to do to this layer. First, I want to sharpen it, and then I want to reduce some of these artifacts that are out in the nebula area. And we may want to add a little bit of local contrast to kind of like a high-pass filter would do to highlight some of the structure. So I'm going to right-click over here to the right of the name and choose Convert to Smart Object. And what smart objects do, it basically saves whatever I turned into a smart object, and then you can apply filters to that. And anytime I double-click on this smart object, it will take me back to editing the original. So first thing I want to do is apply sharpening, and typically we want to apply that to the whole image. So I can just go to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen, and it doesn't really matter what your settings are because, again, you can always go back and change them, but that looks like a pretty good starting point, so we'll apply that. Sometimes it will be too much in some areas, and as you'll see, when the smart object filter is applied, now it shows up kind of indented below the smart object, and it comes with its own mask right here. So if I wanted to mask the sharpening from some areas, I could just paint with black on this mask and mask out that sharpening. The next thing I want to do is get rid of some of these artifacts that are still showing up in the fuzzy areas. And to do that, I want to apply another smart filter, but I want to apply this one selectively and use the mask to select just certain areas to apply it. Since I've already applied a sharpen smart object, I only have one mask for all smart object filters, but I can nest smart objects. So I can right click here and turn this smart object with the sharpen filter into a new smart object. And then I can apply, in order to smooth that out, we'll use the dust and scratches filter, which is under noise in the filters. And I'll be somewhat aggressive with this. Looks like it was at 12. I'm going to even bump that up a little bit higher. And you can see, hopefully you can see in the video, it's getting rid of all of those artifacts and smoothing everything out. But it's also really smoothing out detail here in the center. So that's where we're going to use the mask. I'll click on the mask to make sure it's active, and you can see the little double outline around the mask. I'll grab the brush tool, or tap B on the keyboard, and I want to use black as my foreground color and 100% opacity, and I'll just paint with black on these areas where I want to recover all of that detail. And these areas now are sharpened, but we're using the blur everywhere else to get rid of the artifacts without having to go through and clean them up one at a time. So that looks a lot better. There's a few artifacts in here that we do want to use the dust and scratches, so I can just go to a small brush, tap X to change my foreground color to white, and now if I just paint with white over these areas where there's not much detail, I can paint that noise reduction in pretty quickly and clean these areas up. So I know it seems tedious. In reality, it doesn't take very long, especially if you're not describing what you're doing as you're doing it. And if you go too far, if I come in here and say, whoops, I didn't want to do that, I just switch to black and hide that blurring. If there's some very small areas that are in areas of high detail, just get a very small brush and you can address those. So you can be as careful or as uncareful broad brush as you want. Once we're done, the last thing we'll do is visit the histogram. This looks pretty good. I might add a little bit more contrast to it, because with an HOO image, this is going to be kind of the centerpiece. So let's stop there. We may come back and revisit this. Now we'll just do the same thing to the others. The star layer is pretty straightforward. I'll just drop it into a group, change the name to stars, change the blending mode to screen, and I'm just going to close that group, move it to the top. Oops, moved it into the hydrogen group. Move it to the top and turn it off for now. So lastly, we have the oxygen layer, and we'll do the same thing. Control G, change the name to oxygen, drop in a levels adjustment layer, grab the spot healing brush, clean up some of these areas that are most offensive in areas of high detail where it's going to be a little bit trickier to use the dust and scratches filter. And it doesn't have to be perfect, because since we're using smart objects, we can always come back and do more later. When you have diffraction spikes like that, you can just paint a little X with the spot healing brush, and that does a real nice job of cleaning that up. A lot of artifacts out here, but again, this is areas with no real detail. So we'll be able to use the smart filter to clean most of this up. So at this point, there's a little bright one. If I had more data, this would be a lot cleaner. But there's only about probably 2 hours of 03 data here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this into a smart object. We will add our smart sharpen, and we'll just use the same settings we used for the other layer. And again, because these are smart filters, You can always come back and change the settings that you put on a smart filter anytime in the future. Even, save the file, turn off your computer, come back tomorrow, reopen the file, and as long as you haven't rasterized or flattened the image, all the data is still there in these layers and still editable. So we'll turn this into a smart object again. Again, we're using the feature of being able to nest smart objects. Now we'll apply the dust and scratches filter. And we can see that looks like it's going to be strong enough. It pretty well got rid of all of those artifacts. Click on the smart filter mask itself, grab the brush tool, and now we want to paint with black over these areas where there is detail so that we're not blurring those areas. And we'll just do it fairly crudely. That's good enough for now. This layer is quite a bit brighter overall, so we'll have to go to our levels. And I'm just kind of remembering roughly how bright the hydrogen levels were and trying to get this somewhat compatible. This looks like a bright spot from a star. Let's turn our stars on and see. Yep, we got stars up here. So that's actually kind of residual glow from the stars. I usually don't like that. So this is an area that I did not take out with the healing brush. So let's go back to the original. As I said, we can always go back to the original. Remember, this is a double nested smart object. If I double click on the smart object, it will reopen this smart object in a new document. And so this is where we applied Smart Sharpen. We need to double click and go back one more layer. This gets us back to the original. There's that bright area. So I'm going to grab, in this case, I'm going to grab the healing brush. I find it does a better job with these large areas. And you alt-click to choose an area to sample from and paint over that area. I'm not sure, I think I'll leave this as it is for now. But that has cleaned up that area. Looks like maybe there's one here. So now I'll just click on the X on the tab to close this document, and it will ask, do I want to save it? I'll say yes. And what it's actually doing is saving it into the smart object. So it's updating the contents of the smart object with this newly edited layer. And then it's going to apply the smart filter to sharpen it. And now I'll close this one again, because again we had this nested. Say yes. And now it's updating the smart object that applies the dust and scratches blurring filter. And we'll be right back to our original. There's our smart object, there's the mask, everything's still in place, but that glow up here is gone. So now we want to turn this into a color image. We've got our hydrogen and oxygen, and for whatever reason I tend to put the hydrogen on the bottom and then the oxygen above. It doesn't really matter. To turn this into a color image, we want oxygen to represent green and blue. That makes it an HOO image. Right now, each one of these layer groups is contributing all three color channels, red, green, and blue. And we only want green and blue from the oxygen layer. So I'll double click on this layer group, and that will open the layer styles and the blending options. And since this is an RGB image, you'll see here in the center, it says channels R, G, and B, and there's a check mark in front of each. All we need to do is turn off the R, the red channel, and now we have an HOO image. And if we want to fine-tune it, if we want the oxygen to be a little stronger, we just go back to this levels adjustment layer in the oxygen group, and we can adjust the brightness of the oxygen in the midtones, shadows, highlights, and find the balance that we like the best. We can also use a kind of a local contrast adjustment. A lot of times people will use the either a camera raw plug-in, use clarity and texture, or traditionally it was a high-pass filter. You can use a high-pass filter here, but you can also do it basically the same thing with an unsharp mask. So we've already got this oxygen layer as a smart object, but it has a mask applied, and we don't want to mess with this. So I'm going to, once again, convert this into a smart object. So now it's going to be 3 smart objects nested. But now I'm going to go to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. And the way the unsharp mask filter works, when we apply a very large radius, and by large I mean in the hundreds of pixels, and then we can play with the amount of sharpening, that does very much the same thing that a high-pass sharpening does. So we can adjust that presence or local contrast or whatever you want to call it. That's before, that's after. So I'll click OK, and that's really causing the oxygen to pop here in the center. It's probably a little too strong around the perimeter. So again, we're going to go to the mask, grab our brush tool, and we'll just brush out. We're not brushing out the oxygen, we're removing that filter in these areas. And I think I don't like it right there in the center. And we still have our levels adjustment layer if we want to play with the overall brightness. And this is basically just a matter of tuning it to taste. And that's how you create in this case it's a starless HOO image. If we want to put the stars back in, we just turn the star layer on. And the stars were removed with the unscreen option. So the correct way to put them back in, to get them back exactly the way they left, would be to use the screen blending mode for the stars group. What I find is it tends to be a little too strong that way. So we can do one of two things. We can add a levels adjustment layer here and just pull the center slider to the right to darken the stars. And by darkening the stars, that makes them smaller and less prominent. That's one way to reduce the stars so that they are, less of a distraction. The other way to do it, let me just reset this, rather than screen blending mode, if we use lighten blending mode is much less aggressive, and if we just switch back and forth between screen and lighten, you can see that it's a much less aggressive. What I will sometimes do is put the stars in like this in lighten blending mode, and then make a copy of the stars group, put this copy in screen blending mode, and then we'll apply a layer mask. And if you hold the Alt key down or Option on the Mac, when you click on the Add Layer Mask, it will add a black mask rather than a white mask. So now everything is hidden. I can grab my brush tool, tap X to switch foreground, background colors, make the brush a little smaller, and just go around to some of these bright stars. And this is really just kind of something that you would do, I'll say, to taste. Pick the stars that you think look better bright and put those back in screen blending mode. Maybe something like that. And that to me really adds some sparkle to the stars. So I think we'll quit here. Obviously, if you want to do global adjustments, I said I'm going to quit, but I'm not really. What I want to do is go above my layers that have data, so a bit below the stars. So this would be above the oxygen layer. We can add some global adjustments. So for instance, color balance. And you'll see when you add an adjustment layer, it adds that adjustment layer above the currently selected layer. And we can just play with the kind of overall global color balance. So you can, again, you can adjust that to taste. We can add a hue saturation. You can play with the hue or individual hues if we want to target the cyans, for instance, and make them more blue. And you can basically target individual colors, combinations of colors, or the whole image by itself, and just fine-tune that overall color balance. Let's do one last thing. Let's come back to our oxygen and really highlight the bubble part. So I'm going to open up this group, and what I'm going to do is add another levels adjustment layer, and I'm going to brighten the highlights by grabbing this highlight slider on the right side, pull it in, and you can see it's really bringing out the hydrogen detail here in the center. This was, a fainter oxygen signal. Just find an area, a setting where that looks good and looks realistic. Now I want to hide that everywhere, and the mask is currently white, which means it's being applied everywhere. If I invert the mask, which I can do by making sure the mask is selected and then Control-I, Command-I on a Mac, now we just hid that adjustment. Now I'll grab my brush tool with white as the foreground and just paint that back in locally. So, and if you want to paint it in partially, that's 0. That's 100%, which to me 100% looks too strong. 0 doesn't look strong enough. So you can grab something in between and just feather that in a little bit. And then you can always go back to the settings themselves and adjust it a little bit more to fine tune. So now I think I'll call that done. So there is the Wolf Rayet WR134 region in the HOO color palette using PixInsight and mostly Photoshop then to do the final image assembly and color mapping. I hope you found this useful. If so, be sure to like and subscribe to get notifications when a new video is released. If you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the comments. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.